I hope that you all had a good Thanksgiving, whether it was a big family gathering or a Friendsgiving like I had at my house. I say, I hope, knowing that for a lot of people, those traditional family gatherings are something to be dreaded rather than something to be looked forward to. I've always said of my own family of origin that I believe I had one of the less miserable childhoods. For 45 years, I've done quite a bit of pastoral counseling, and I've heard the horror stories of families with history of child abuse, both beatings and unfortunately sexual assault. I've done work with a lot of drug and alcohol addicted people and their family members. And I have known people who lived in such chronic poverty that trying to prepare a holiday meal was more of a humiliation of charity or of profound hunger. My family had none of that. There was no violence, there was no sexual abuse, no one drank any alcohol, and we were pretty comfortably ensconced in the middle class of rural Kentucky. Our house was clean, it was safe, our clothes were clean, we went to the doctor when we were sick, we went to church every Sunday, and there was a family understanding that the children, unlike our parents, would all earn college degrees. None of the people who scheduled appointments with me in my church office would have described their family in the way that I just described mine. However, when I did go away to college, and my first college was just 30 miles from my home, I was always amazed by my university peers who got homesick. And as the Thanksgiving break loomed large, most of them talked about how eager they were to go home. For me, living at college was an escape from the constant controlling criticism, bickering, judgment, and guilt. What made my peers homesick, what made them long to go home, was an anticipation of some warmth, of being greeted by affection, acceptance, of knowing that they had a place in the family, a sense of belonging. While we had a nice house, car, clothes, plenty of good food, medical care, education, and a church life, there weren't many warm fuzzies. Darn near none. No comfortable sense that you could just let your hair down and be yourself. My mother was a Puritan lady who was, I'm not exaggerating, suspicious of happiness. If you were having a good time, she assumed you were up to no good. My father was a World War II veteran whose mind was wounded by the war's carnage, and he lived every day in the midst of the anger that he used to mask his constant fear. My three siblings and I married young. We were all still in college. That often happens to children who grew up in homes that were devoid of affection. You want love, you want intimacy, you want to feel those warm fuzzies, but for us, that kind of thing was kind of like ghosts, something that everyone talked about, but no one had ever really seen. I shouldn't speak for my siblings, but at least for me, our attempts at finding the love and warm fuzzies we longed for were cursed by the baggage we took from home with us. It took me a long time to understand what was really wrong with my family of origin, and even longer to learn a better way of creating a happy home life myself. The harsh perfectionism that ruled our childhoods, and, I could say, made us successful in our careers, never really worked well at home. It should have been obvious, but as is true of most things that should be obvious, it wasn't. My siblings found reasons to rarely be around my parents once they were on their own, but being the youngest, I had an overwrought sense of obligation that I felt like I needed to make sure that my parents were not alone on the holidays until they had passed away. My oldest brother, having at the time the most stable family and work situation, rolled up his sleeves and took on the task of caring for our parents in their last years. My sister actually passed away before my father did, and I have only seen my brothers at my parents' funeral. Other than occasional Facebook comments, we have fallen into the icy silence that is our family inheritance. Ironically, shortly after writing that paragraph, I received a text message from my older brother telling me that he had cancer that was not responding to chemotherapy, and that he had chosen to end all treatments and live with some gusto in the last weeks of his life. Forgive me for sharing such a personal issue, but it would seem to me to be dishonest if I didn't tell you while I'm talking about family conflict. For all of us who hope to heal family divisions, we should be aware that we are not guaranteed another holiday season, or in my case, not even Christmas. Even without a terminal diagnosis, folks, we should view these things with a certain sense of urgency, because none of us knows when it will become too late. I wanted to raise the issue of family conflict today in the shadow of Thanksgiving, because the great thing about this season is that the second big family holiday in America is just a month away. If Thanksgiving was a failure in your family, good news. You get a second chance in less than a month. The opening line of Leo Tolstoy's novel, Anna Karenina, succinctly says, "All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own unique way." There are libraries full of books about the various flavors of hell that we create in unhappy families. Sometimes it's alcohol, violence, sexual abuse, infidelity, gambling or drug addiction, various mental health issues, and in our day, more commonly, it's a difference in politics or moral differences. We had a kind of diagnosis in my pastoral counseling training called conflict-habituated families. Families that simply didn't know what to do if they weren't in conflict. No one could even express themselves if they were not shouting or talking through clenched teeth, as if anger is the only motivation for conversation. I spent years in my young adult life sending letters to my older siblings, reminding them that we could recreate a happy family. We didn't have to just imitate our parents. We could become a happy and loving family if only we could all decide that we wanted one. The most articulate answer I ever received to those entreaties was, "No thanks." You can't play tennis, folks, if there's not someone on the other side of the net occasionally hitting a ball back. After a few years of lobbing a ball over the net and never getting anyone to play, you'll probably give up. I did. But still, it didn't have to be that way for my family, and it certainly doesn't have to be that way for your family. In the most severe cases, reconciliation may seem like it's impossible. Sometimes there are root causes that really shouldn't be dismissed, shouldn't be swept under the rug. There are forms of abuse that you don't ever need to pretend either didn't happen or that they no longer matter. But sometimes the burden of small resentments grows and grows so large that you can't even imagine life without it. I did my master's thesis on the treatment of alcoholism, and after a couple of years of going to 4 or 5 AA meetings every week, I can tell you that I heard a lot of nightmare scenarios. Now, as I said, there was no drinking in my family, but when I became a student pastor, I had alcoholics in my church, and it became a fascinating study for me to try to understand why they drank so much and what could be done to help them get sober. Most of the time, though, whenever there's an AA meeting, usually in a church basement somewhere, there's an adjacent room in the same building where Al-Anon meets. Al-Anon, the program for the family members of alcoholics. And the alcoholics would always point at that room and refer to it as the sick room. That seems dismissive, I know, but I can tell you that it's not entirely inaccurate. Alcohol addiction is not a problem that typically arrives at a family's doorstep unaccompanied. There are usually some pretty serious mental health issues going on in the family members of an alcoholic. But here's the irony. Every single AA group, whether it was a tiny group meeting in the basement of the Methodist church outside of town, or the big group that met in the AA building down off the town square, every single group had its own success stories. And oftentimes it was the sickest people who eventually found their way into being the most healthy. And sadly, a lot of the time, the people who seemed like they had the most to live for and had the fewest problems, they were the ones who just couldn't find a way to minimize their conflict and maximize their joy. I will tell you with some shame that some of my lowest functioning counseling clients, the ones who exhausted and exasperated me, the ones that I just wished would stop wasting my time, eventually turned into some of the most remarkable success stories of my life. You may think that your family is just impossible. And I don't know, maybe you're right. But what if they're not impossible? What if there is a chance that your family of origin could become, if not an astounding success, at least a much more healthy family than it has been in the past? I'm not one of those pie-in-the-sky preachers who will tell you that everything can be fixed with forgiveness and unconditional love. That's not true. There are offenses that are so evil that any kind of unconditional love or forgiveness would be, in and of itself, rather sick. However, the things that cause distance in most families are typically so venial that they would embarrass Charles Darwin. The famous Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, after he had survived a horrifying Nazi death camp during the Holocaust, said, "Suffering is like a gas. It expands to fill the space allowed to it." Even in the torture and deprivation of the Holocaust, each individual plays a certain role in choosing how much of your skull you're going to save and reserve to feel pain. I'm not saying that your drunk uncle didn't insult you at Thanksgiving. I didn't say that your parents didn't love one of your siblings more than they ever loved you. It may be that your brother even owes you money that he clearly has no plans to repay. But you still get to decide how much that's going to hurt you. 7 years ago, 2 women co-authored a book that became a New York Times bestseller that was cryptically titled, "Let That Shit Go." That's not to say that you ignore the coworker who is sexually harassing you. Report them to HR, maybe even get a restraining order, but you don't have to let them live rent-free in your skull. You play a part in choosing how much of your life will be given over to suffering. At least one overzealous marketing person has even tried to sell coffee mugs with the saying and an image of the Buddha to suggest that it was actually Buddha who first told us to let that shit go. And that, I can assure you, is a false attribution. However, even though I'm certain that Buddha didn't say it just that way, he did teach that life is full of, defined by suffering. And the only way out of that suffering is detachment. To let go of expectations, to let go of resentments. So, in rather coarse vernacular, the Buddha would tell you, before your family Christmas gathering, try your best to just let that shit go. And save room in your heart and your head to have a more loving and joyous holiday. Turn on some music. Open a bottle of wine. Tell a non-offensive joke. And try not to make it so darned obvious that you think your Trump-supporting family members are complete idiots. Now, that's just my opinion. But you already know that I'm right.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.